The thunder of hooves was the first warning, a percussive drumbeat against the baked hard earth of the Arizona Territory. Jake Riley, a man whose past was etched in the lines around his weary eyes, felt the vibration through the worn leather of the stagecoach seat. He had been staring out at the endless expanse of red rock and skeletal saguaro, trying to lose himself in the shimmering heat haze, a penance for a man running from the fire in his memory. But the desert offered no absolution, only a reflection of his own emptiness. Then came the crack of rifle fire, sharp and definitive, shattering the afternoon's oppressive silence. The stagecoach lurched violently, the driver's curse swallowed by a woman's scream from within the cabin. Jake's hand, a thing of instinct honed by years, carrying a U.S. Marshal's badge, moved toward his hip, only to find it empty. He had left that life behind, along with the Colt peacemaker that had been its symbol. He was just a passenger now, a ghost drifting west, with no destination in mind. The coach slewed to a halt, dust boiling through the open windows, thick and choking. Outside, masked riders circled like vultures, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas. The door was wrenched open, and the raw, brutal reality of the moment filled the cramped space. A burly outlaw with eyes like chips of flint leaned in the barrel of his rifle, a cold, unblinking circle of death. Valuables, he snarled the word, a gravelly command. Now. A portly salesman fumbled with his wallet, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unclasp the leather. A young woman, no older than 20, sat opposite Jake, her face pale as bone china. She clutched a small bag to her chest, her knuckles white. Jake remained perfectly still, his expression a mask of detached observation. He had seen this 100 times. The fear, the desperation, the ugly greed. It was a language he knew too well, a language he no longer wished to speak. The leader of the gang swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and confident. He was taller than the others, his duster immaculate despite the dust, a stark contrast to his gang's ragged appearance. He wore a black mask that covered the upper half of his face, but his mouth was visible, a thin, cruel line that curled into a smirk as he surveyed his terrified audience. He ignored the salesman's offered money, his gaze fixing on the young woman. That he said, his voice surprisingly calm and cultured, is a pretty little thing you're holding. He gestured with a gloved hand, not at her bag, but at the delicate silver chain around her neck. At its end hung a small heart-shaped locket, intricately engraved with wildflowers. The woman's hand flew to her throat. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." It was my mother's. The leader's smirk widened. All the more reason for me to have it. He reached in his fingers, closing around the locket. The woman cried out a sound of pure anguish as he tore it from her neck, snapping the fragile chain. And in that instant, Jake's world stopped. The dust, the heat, the fear, it all vanished, replaced by the roar of flames and the scent of burning pine. He saw the locket not in the outlaw's hand, but lying on a scorched floorboard, its silver tarnished by soot. He saw the hand that had worn it, his wife's hand, pale and still. Sarah. The locket was identical. The same delicate heart, the same etched wildflowers. It was a mirror image of the one he had given her on their first anniversary, the one she was wearing the night the Territorial Bank burned to the ground. He froze. His muscles locked, his breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to draw a weapon that wasn't there, to unleash the cold fury that had once made him the most feared marshal in the territory. But all he could do was watch, paralyzed by the ghost of a silver locket. The leader held it up, letting it twist in the sunlight, a cruel trophy. He glanced at Jake, his eyes dark and unreadable, above the mask seeming to bore right through him. It felt for a terrifying moment as if the man knew. As if this entire brutal spectacle was for him alone. The outlaws backed away, their raid complete. The leader mounted his horse, tucking the locket into his duster pocket. With a final lingering look at Jake, he spurred his horse and galloped away his gang, following like shadows into the blinding glare of the sun. The dust settled, leaving behind a profound silence, broken only by the young woman's heartbroken sobs. Jake didn't hear her. He was still in the fire, the guilt of physical weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had failed to save Sarah then, and he had just failed to save her memory now. Trouble had found him not as an outlaw, but as a specter from his past. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his flight from himself was over. Redemption Gulch was a town clinging to life by a thread of dust and desperation. It baked under the Arizona sun, its single street a river of red dirt lined with sun-bleached wooden storefronts. The glare of the sun turned the sand to fire, and the skeletal remains of saguaro cacti clawed at a bleached blue sky. The air was thin and hot, tasting of grit and broken dreams. It was the perfect place for a man to disappear, which was precisely why Jake Riley had stepped off the morning coach and into its suffocating embrace. He carried a single carpet bag, his shoulders stooped with a weariness that went deeper than the miles he had traveled. He had resigned his marshal's badge the day after he buried Sarah. The official report called the bank fire a tragic accident, a stray lamp overturned during a botched robbery. But Jake knew the truth. He had been there exchanging fire with the robber, and in the chaos, he had shot a man he believed to be an accomplice, an innocent bystander, the papers later said. While the town hailed him a hero for stopping the thief, he saw only failure. He hadn't saved the bank, he had killed an innocent man, and the fire had claimed his wife. The guilt was a cancer, and he had come to this forgotten corner of the world to let it consume him in peace. He took a room at the boarding house, a rickety two-story building whose sign creaked a mournful tune with every gust of wind. His window overlooked the main street, giving him a clear view of the town's meager pulse. He saw prospectors with hollow eyes, cowboys whose bravado couldn't hide their poverty, and women whose faces were etched with the harsh realities of frontier life. And he saw her. Eliza May was not like the others. She rode into town on a sturdy mare, sitting astride the horse with an ease that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. She was dressed not in a restrictive dress, but in practical buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt, her hair tied back in a sensible braid. There was a resilience in her posture, a fierce independence in the way she hitched her horse and strode into the general store, her gaze direct and unflinching. She was, Jake noted with a detached appreciation, a woman who did not bend easily. He learned her story in whispers and murmurs from the other boarders. Her father had died a year prior, leaving her the sole owner of the Sweetwater Creek Ranch, a modest homestead a few miles out of town. It wasn't much, but it had one thing that made it more valuable than gold. In this parched land, it controlled the only reliable water source in the entire valley. This fact also brought her to the attention of the town's other notable figure, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was the opposite of Redemption Gulch. He was polished, charismatic, and impeccably dressed. He owned the saloon, the land office, and it was rumored the sheriff. He presented himself as a benefactor, a man of vision who would bring prosperity to this struggling community. He spoke of dams and irrigation, of turning the desert green. But his vision required one thing: control of Sweetwater Creek. Jake saw him for what he was. He had seen men like Blackwood before, men who cloaked their ambition in the language of progress, whose smiles were as sharp and dangerous as a hidden knife. He watched as Blackwood courted the town with promises and bought loyalty with whiskey and coin. He also watched as a shadow of fear fell over anyone who dared to stand in his way. Jake wanted no part of it. Eliza May's fight was not his. He was done with fights. He was a spectator now, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. But the desert had a cruel sense of irony. One evening, seeking to drown the memories in a glass of cheap whiskey, Jake found himself in the smoky confines of Blackwood's saloon. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat. Eliza May was at the bar negotiating with the bartender for a barrel of flour, her voice clear and firm. Blackwood was there, seated at his usual corner table, flanked by two of his hired guns. He watched Eliza with an air of predatory amusement. When she finished her business and turned to leave, one of Blackwood's men, a lout named Tanner, with a perpetually sneering face, stepped into her path. "Well now, Miss May," Tanner drawled, his eyes roaming over her with casual insolence. "A lady shouldn't be out so late all by her lonesome. It ain't safe." Eliza's chin lifted. "I can take care of myself, Tanner. Now move." Tanner chuckled a low, ugly sound. "Maybe you need a real man to show you how a ranch is run. Blackwood's made you a fair offer. You'd be wise to take it before you have a little accident." His hand shot out, grabbing her arm. Eliza flinched, her face hardening with a mixture of anger and alarm. And in that moment, Jake saw Sarah again, her face in the firelight, her eyes wide with fear. The memory, sharp as a shard of glass, pierced through his carefully constructed apathy. He hadn't been there to protect his wife. He would not stand by and watch another woman be threatened. He didn't move quickly. He didn't raise his voice. He simply rose from his stool and walked toward them, his presence a sudden cold weight in the room. He stopped beside Tanner, his shadow falling over the man. He didn't look at Eliza. His gaze was fixed on the hand gripping her arm. "Let her go," Jake said. His voice was low and quiet, yet it cut through the saloon's noise like a razor. Tanner turned, his sneer faltering as he took in the stranger. He saw a man in dusty clothes, his face unshaven, his eyes holding a chilling stillness. "This ain't your concern, old man." Jake didn't respond. He simply continued to stare at Tanner's hand. The silence stretched thick with unspoken violence. The entire saloon seemed to hold its breath. Even Blackwood leaned forward, his polite smile gone, replaced by a look of sharp curiosity. Tanner, unnerved by the stranger's absolute calm, finally released Eliza's arm. "Reckon you've got business elsewhere?" Jake said, his voice still level, still quiet. Tanner hesitated, glancing toward Blackwood for a signal. Blackwood gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Defeated, Tanner spat on the floor and backed away, melting into the crowd. Jake turned to Eliza, his expression unreadable. "Mom." He gave a curt nod and walked back to the bar, picked up his whiskey, and downed it in one swallow. He had wanted to remain a ghost, but with a few quiet words, he had just made himself flesh and blood. He had drawn a line in the dust of Redemption Gulch, and in doing so had placed himself squarely in Silas Blackwood's path. His fate and Eliza's were now bound together. The next morning, as the sun began its relentless assault on the valley, Silas Blackwood made his move. He didn't send his thugs. He was far too clever for such a crude approach. Instead, he arrived at Eliza's ranch in a polished buggy, a legal document held delicately in his gloved hands. Jake, who had ridden out early under the pretense of scouting the land, watched from a rocky outcrop overlooking the homestead. He had known Blackwood would retaliate, and he had a feeling it wouldn't be with fists or bullets. Eliza met Blackwood on her porch, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of her arm. She stood tall, her stance defiant, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her tone as brittle as dry leaves, "this is private property." Blackwood smiled, a brilliant predatory flash of white teeth. "My dear Eliza, I believe you'll find it is my property." He stepped forward and presented the paper to her. "A deed, Signed by your late father selling Sweetwater Creek Ranch to me. It is all perfectly legal. I was merely waiting for a respectable period of mourning to pass before taking possession. Eliza snatched the document, her eyes scanning the neat script and the familiar, if slightly shaky, signature of her father. Jake saw her confidence crumble, replaced by a wave of confusion and disbelief. This is impossible. My father would never sell. This ranch was his life. Grief can make men do foolish things, Blackwood said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Perhaps he was in debt. Perhaps he simply lost his nerve. The reasons no longer matter. The document is ironclad. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I am a reasonable man. I will give you 1 week to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. After that, his smile vanished. I will have the sheriff escort you off my land. He tipped his hat, turned with the unhurried grace of a victor, and departed, leaving Eliza standing on the porch, the paper trembling in her hand like a captured bird. Jake waited until the buggy was a mere speck in the distance before riding down. Eliza looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with a desperate, angry fire. Did you hear? He thinks he can just steal my home. Let me see it. Jake said, his voice calm and steady. He took the deed and examined it, his marshal's eye for detail immediately kicking in. The paper was aged correctly, the ink consistent with the period. The signature was a near-perfect match for her father's. To a casual observer, it was flawless. But Jake had spent years looking at forgeries. He noticed a slight hesitation in the upstroke of the M in May, a faint feathering of the ink that suggested the pen had been held too long by a hand meticulously copying, not signing naturally. It was a masterful fake, but a fake nonetheless. He's lying, Jake said simply, but proving it is another matter. Thus began their race against time. The ticking clock of Blackwood's 1-week deadline hung over them, a constant, oppressive presence. They couldn't go to the sheriff. He was in Blackwood's pocket. They had to find the truth themselves. Jake's old instincts, long dormant, resurfaced. He was a lawman again, though, without a badge. His investigation started with the town's doctor, a man named Elias Thorne, whose hands shook from a dependency on laudanum and whose eyes held the haunted look of a man who knew too many secrets. Jake found him in his dusty office, the air thick with the cloying smell of chemicals and regret. The night John May died, Jake began, his voice low. You signed the death certificate, said it was his heart. Dr. Thorne flinched, refusing to meet Jake's gaze. It was. A weak heart couldn't take the strain of this land. And you were the witness on this deed. Jake continued, laying the forgery on the desk. You saw him sign away his life's work. The doctor's hands trembled more violently. He stared at the signature, a sheen of sweat on his brow. My memory isn't what it used to be. Jake leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. A man like Blackwood has a long memory, doctor, and a short temper. But a man who helps uncover the truth. The law has a way of remembering that too. The veiled threat, or perhaps the promise of protection, was enough. Thorne's composure cracked. He wasn't well, the doctor confessed, his voice ragged. John was sick for weeks. Feverish. He couldn't have held a pen steady, let alone ridden to town to sign a deed. Blackwood brought the paper to me after John was already gone. He made it clear what would happen if I refused to sign as a witness. It was the first thread. The next led Jake to the Territorial Land Office, a cramped, dusty room run by a timid clerk named Miller, a man who seemed to jump at his own shadow. Jake asked to see the official record of the land transfer. Miller paled, stammering that the records were misplaced. Misplaced, Jake's voice, was cold iron, or paid to be misplaced. Under Jake's relentless, quiet pressure, Miller crumbled. He admitted that Blackwood had paid him handsomely to file the new deed and lose the old one. He hadn't destroyed the original, though. Terrified of Blackwood, but also of the law, he had hidden it. With trembling hands, he retrieved a dusty ledger from beneath a loose floorboard. Tucked inside was the original deed, clearly stating the land belonged to Eliza May, free and clear. They had the proof. Blackwood's scheme was built on a foundation of lies and intimidation. But as Jake held the two documents side by side, the genuine and the forgery, a cold dread washed over him. He asked Miller where and when the official territorial deeds were notarized and stored. They used to be held at the old territorial bank, Miller whispered, for safekeeping. But that was before the fire. The word struck Jake like a physical blow. The fire. His fire. The world narrowed to a single, terrifying point of focus. He looked at Eliza, who was watching him with concern, and she must have seen the ghosts rise in his eyes. "Jake, what is it?" He couldn't speak. He just stared at the deeds, the pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed, clicking into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just about water rights. This wasn't a random act of greed. Blackwood hadn't just stumbled upon Redemption Gulch. He had come here for a reason. He had come here for him. The fight for Eliza's land was now inextricably linked to the worst night of his life, and the stakes had just become terrifyingly personal. The days that followed were a blur of shared purpose and simmering tension. With the proof of the forgery in hand, Eliza's defiance was rekindled, but the revelation of the bank fire connection had plunged Jake into a dark, introspective silence. He and Eliza spent their days fortifying the ranch and their nights keeping watch, taking shifts by the glow of a small campfire. The vast, starry sky of the Arizona night seemed to press down on them, magnifying the intimacy of their forced proximity. In these quiet hours, the walls Jake had built around himself began to crumble. Eliza, sensing the turmoil within him, did not press. Instead, she spoke of her father, of his love for the land, of the way he taught her to read the seasons in the shifting colors of the desert. Her stories were a gentle balm, a reminder of a world that existed beyond violence and regret. One night, as the coyotes sang their lonely lament to the moon, she looked at him across the flames. "You carry a heavy burden, Jake Riley. It's more than just this fight for my ranch, isn't it?" Jake stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes, mirroring the inferno in his memory. "I was a marshal," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I was sworn to protect people. On the worst night of my life, I failed. A woman died because of me. My wife." He told her everything. The robbery, the bystander, he shot the fire that consumed the bank and stole Sarah from him. He spoke of the guilt that had been his only companion since that day. Eliza listened without interruption, her expression one of deep empathy. When he finished, the silence was filled only with the crackling of the fire. "You can't blame yourself for a fire you didn't start," she said softly. "You were doing your duty." "My duty was to protect her," he countered, his voice raw. "And she's gone." Their bond deepened in that shared vulnerability. It wasn't a sudden passion, but a slow-growing respect forged in mutual struggle. He saw in her a strength he had once admired in Sarah, and she saw in him a good man tormented by a past he didn't deserve. But Blackwood was not idle. He seemed to know their every move. One morning, after Jake had successfully diverted a stream, Blackwood's men had dammed to cut off Eliza's water. He returned to find something laid carefully on his saddle. It was a single pressed wildflower, a desert marigold, Sarah's favorite. She used to press them in her books. A chill snaked down Jake's spine. It was a message cold and deliberate. This wasn't just business. It was a cruel psychological game. Blackwood wasn't just trying to drive him out. He was trying to break him piece by agonizing piece. The land, the water rights, even Eliza, they were all just instruments in a symphony of revenge Jake didn't yet understand. He knew he was being hunted, but he still didn't know why. The answer arrived with devastating force. Armed with the original deed and Dr. Thorne's sworn, albeit reluctant testimony, Jake and Eliza rode into town, ready to expose Blackwood. They planned to present their evidence to the circuit judge due to arrive the next day, but as they neared the land office, they saw at first a thin plume of smoke curling into the sky. They spurred their horses, arriving to find the small building engulfed in flames. The townspeople stood by, watching helplessly as the office, along with Miller's ledger and the original deed, was reduced to ashes. Blackwood stood apart from the crowd, a look of solemn regret on his face that was so perfectly feigned it was obscene. His eyes met Jake's across the inferno, and in them Jake saw a triumphant, mocking gleam. He had not only destroyed their proof, but had also thrown Jake's greatest failure back in his face. Another fire, another loss. The revelation hit Jake with the force of a physical blow. The forged deed, the intimidation, the personal taunts, it was all a prelude. Blackwood had been orchestrating a slow, cruel reenactment of Jake's tragedy. He wasn't just after the land. He was after Jake's soul. The bank fire hadn't been an accident that connected them by chance. It was the very source of this conflict. This fight for Redemption Gulch was nothing less than the final act of a vendetta that had begun years ago in the smoke and chaos of another burning building. And Jake, with dawning horror, realized he was no longer fighting for a stranger's land. He was fighting for his own life against a ghost from a past he had just discovered was still very much alive. Enraged and cornered, Blackwood abandoned all pretense of legality and charm. The mask of the sophisticated gentleman was cast aside, revealing the ruthless predator beneath. With the evidence of his forgery now turned to ash, he resorted to the bluntest of instruments, brute force. That night, under the cold, indifferent light of a sliver moon, his men descended on the Sweetwater Creek Ranch. Jake and Eliza were prepared for an attack, but they were not prepared for the swift, calculated brutality of it. There was no warning, only the sudden explosion of gunfire and the splintering of wood as the front door was kicked in. Jake reacted instantly, shoving Eliza toward the back of the small cabin and returning fire into the darkness. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. The fight was short and vicious. A blow from a rifle butt sent Jake to his knees, his vision exploding in a starburst of pain. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Eliza struggling against the grip of two of Blackwood's men, her face a mask of defiant fury, before she was dragged out into the night. He awoke to the throbbing agony in his head and a silence that was more terrifying than the gunfire. He was alone. Eliza was gone. On the rough-hewn table pinned by a Bowie knife was a note. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and chillingly familiar. Riley, your interference has come to an end. If you wish to see the lady alive again, come to the abandoned Specter's Peak silver mine at sundown. Come alone. Any tricks, and she dies. You started a fire long ago. It's time you felt the burn. B. Specter's Peak. The name was a whispered legend in Redemption Gulch, a place of bad luck and forgotten ghosts. The mine had been abandoned for decades, its tunnels notoriously unstable, its head frame a skeletal silhouette against the sky. It was the perfect place for an ambush, a tomb of Blackwood's own choosing, Jake's mind cleared the pain, sharpening into a single cold point of focus. This was the endgame. Blackwood had stripped him of his allies, his evidence, and now his purpose. He had taken the one person who had managed to breach the walls of his grief. It was a direct challenge man to man with Eliza's life as the prize. As the afternoon sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red, a fierce wind kicked up from the east. The air grew thick with dust, the horizon blurring into a brown haze. A dust storm was coming, a fitting backdrop for the coming confrontation. Jake didn't waste time gathering an army. The note had been clear: come alone. This was his fight, his burden. He checked the load in his revolver, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hand. He saddled his horse and rode out, not toward the setting sun, but into the heart of the gathering storm. The wind howled around him, whipping dust into his eyes, but he rode on his face a grim, determined mask. He was no longer the weary traveler, the haunted widower. He was Marshal Jacob Riley again, riding to a final reckoning in a place where only one of them would walk away. The skeletal remains of the headframe clawed at the blood-red sunset as he approached a gallows waiting for its victim. The entrance to Specter's Peak Mine was a jagged maw in the mountainside, exhaling a cold, damp breath that smelled of stale earth and decay. Outside, the dust storm raged, a shrieking vortex of sand and wind that muffled all sound and reduced the world to a suffocating, gritty twilight. Inside, it was preternaturally quiet, the only sounds the creak of rotting support beams and the steady, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the oppressive darkness. Jake dismounted, tethering his horse to a withered juniper tree. He drew his Colt, the feel of its checkered grip, a familiar anchor in the chaos. He stepped into the mine, his eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows down the main tunnel, creating a disorienting landscape of phantom shapes and bottomless pits. Blackwood Jake's voice was a low growl swallowed by the mine's heavy silence. Riley, punctual as always. The voice echoed from deeper within the mine. It was calm, controlled, laced with a triumphant irony, a lawman to the very end. Jake moved forward cautiously, his boots crunching on loose gravel. He rounded a bend in the tunnel and saw them. Eliza was tied to a thick support pillar, a gag silencing her protests, but her eyes blazed with defiance. Standing before her, bathed in the lantern light, was Silas Blackwood. He was no longer the polished land baron. He had shed the tailored suit for practical dark clothing, and the smug smile was gone, replaced by an expression of intense burning hatred. "Let her go, Blackwood," Jake set his pistol steady. "This is between you and me." "Oh, it has always been between you and me," Blackwood replied, taking a slow step forward. "She is merely the final piece of the lesson, the part where you watch everything you care about turn to ash." He reached up and with a deliberate motion untied the black mask he wore. Jake's breath caught. He had expected to see the face of a stranger. But the face revealed in the flickering light was one he knew, one that had haunted his nightmares for years. It was older, harder, etched with lines of grief and rage. But it was unmistakably the face from the wanted posters connected to the bank robbery. The face of the man whose brother he had shot. "You," Jake whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. "Silas Kane." "You remember?" Kane said, a bitter satisfaction in his voice. "I am impressed. Most men forget the names of the innocent people they gunned down." "He was your brother," Jake stated, the pieces falling into place with sickening finality. "He wasn't an innocent bystander." Innocent Kane laughed, a harsh, broken sound that echoed off the damp rock walls. "My brother Thomas was a clerk at that bank. He discovered that a railroad baron, a man named Devereaux, was using the bank to launder money and hide fraudulent land grants. Thomas was going to expose him, So Devereaux framed him for embezzlement, then hired a common thief to rob the bank and start a fire to destroy the evidence. My brother wasn't an accomplice, Riley. He was a hero trying to stop them. And you shot him. You murdered him in cold blood. The world tilted under Jake's feet. The official story, his own memory, it all fractured. Had he killed a hero? Was his guilt even greater than he had imagined? I saw a man with a gun. Jake said, his voice strained. In the chaos, you saw what Devereaux wanted you to see. Kane roared, his composure finally breaking. My brother was trying to save the ledgers from the fire. His entire life has been a quest for vengeance. Not just against you, but against a system that let a man like Devereaux walk away clean. Every move I made, buying the land, controlling the town, it was all to draw you here to this place, to make you suffer as I have suffered. As he spoke, one of Kane's men, the same sneering thug Tanner, shifted uncomfortably behind him. A flicker of doubt crossed the hired gun's face. This wasn't the simple land grab he'd signed on for. This was the obsessive madness of a vengeful man. Kane raised a pistol, his eyes locking with Jake's. This ends now. But as he did, he revealed the final piece of the puzzle. That locket I took from the girl on the stagecoach. It was a message for you, a reminder of what you lost. My brother gave your wife that locket, a copy of her own, as a warning. Inside it wasn't a picture, but a key. Jake's mind reeled. A key. A key to a safe deposit box. Kane continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A box containing the original ledgers, the proof of Devereaux's crimes. Thomas gave it to your wife for safekeeping, trusting the marshal's wife over anyone. He was trying to protect the evidence. He was trying to be the hero you claimed to be. In that moment, the entire tragedy was reframed. Sarah hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been part of it. She had been helping Thomas, and Jake, in his blind pursuit of a common thief, had been a pawn in Devereaux's deadly game. He and Kane were not just hero and villain. They were two men destroyed by the same lie. A deep groaning sound echoed from the ceiling above them. The strain of the storm outside, combined with the mine's instability, was taking its toll. Dust and small pebbles rained down. Tanner, seeing his boss consumed by a mad quest based on a half-truth, made his choice. Boss, this is crazy. The mine's coming down. Kane ignored him, his focus entirely on Jake. She died because of you, Riley. Now you die for her. He fired. Jake dove to the side as the shot ricocheted off the rock wall. At the same time, Tanner, in a moment of moral crisis, drew his own weapon not at Jake, but hesitating between his mad employer and the collapsing tunnel. It became a chaotic three-way standoff in the heart of a dying mountain. The ground shuddered violently, and with a deafening roar, the main support beam above them splintered and cracked. The final confrontation had begun, not with a simple duel, but in a storm of dust, deceit, and collapsing earth. The world devolved into a chaotic symphony of destruction. The deafening groan of tortured wood and splitting rock filled the air as the mine began to collapse in earnest. The lantern, casting their desperate drama into relief, was extinguished by a shower of dirt, plunging them into near-total darkness, pierced only by the flashes of panicked gunfire and the faint gray light filtering from the storm-choked entrance. In the chaos, Jake's instincts took over. His fight was no longer with Silas Kane. It was with the mountain itself. He scrambled toward Eliza, who was struggling against her bonds as debris rained down around her. Another shot from Kane's pistol whizzed past Jake's ear, the sound almost lost in the cacophony of the collapse. Tanner, caught between his conscience and his employer, fired a shot toward the ceiling, not to hit anyone, but as a desperate, panicked act. "We've got to get out!" he screamed, his voice thin with terror. A massive support beam, thick as a man's torso, finally gave way, crashing down between Jake and Kane, separating them in a cloud of dust and splintered wood. It was a moment of decision. Jake could try to circle around to finish the fight with the man who had tormented him, or he could save Eliza. He looked at her, her eyes wide with fear, but also with an unshakable trust in him. He saw Sarah in that gaze, and he knew he would not make the same mistake twice. Vengeance was a ghost's game. Life was for the living. He lunged for Eliza, pulling his knife and sawing frantically at the thick ropes binding her wrists. "I've got you," he grunted the words of promise. On the other side of the fallen timber, Silas Kane was a figure of pure, self-destructive fury. He clawed at the wreckage, his face contorted with rage, trying to get a clear shot at Jake. "You won't escape me, Riley. Not again." But the mountain had passed its own judgment. A section of the tunnel roof gave way directly above him. Kane looked up, his eyes widening in a final moment of shocked realization, not of his own folly, but of his ultimate failure. He was consumed by a cascade of rock and earth, his final curse swallowed by the roar of the avalanche. His obsession had become his tomb. Tanner, seeing his boss disappear, abandoned the fight and fled blindly into the darkness, his fate uncertain. Freed from her bonds, Eliza grabbed Jake's hand. "This way," she yelled, pulling him toward a small side tunnel she had noticed earlier, one that seemed slightly more stable. They scrambled through the narrow passage as the main tunnel imploded behind them, the ground shaking so violently it threw them from their feet. Crawling on hands and knees, they emerged back into the main passage just feet from the entrance and stumbled out into the raging dust storm. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, the wind tearing at them, their bodies battered and bruised. The entrance to Specter's Peak mine was gone, sealed by a mountain of rock. Silas Kane and the truth of his brother's death were buried within. The return to Redemption Gulch was slow and arduous. The storm had passed by the time they arrived, leaving the town washed clean and eerily quiet. Their appearance covered in dirt and exhaustion drew stares. The first person they sought was the circuit judge who had arrived as scheduled. With the information about the key and the safe deposit box, everything changed. Jake, acting on a lawman's authority the judge temporarily granted him, sent a wire to the territorial capital. The safe deposit box was located and opened. Inside, just as Kane had said, were Thomas Kane's ledgers detailing Devereaux's entire criminal enterprise, and a signed confession from the thief Devereaux had hired, implicating the Baron in the robbery and the arson. The evidence was irrefutable. Thomas Kane's name was cleared. He was posthumously hailed as a hero who had died trying to expose corruption. The railroad baron Devereaux was arrested, his empire built on lies, crumbling overnight. And Jacob Riley, the disgraced marshal, was vindicated. He hadn't killed an innocent man. He had been an unwitting pawn in a scheme far larger than he could have imagined. His name was cleared, not just in the eyes of the law, but in his own. The crushing weight of guilt he had carried for years finally began to lift. He was no longer a man haunted by a fatal mistake, but the man who had at long last brought the whole truth to light. Months later, peace settled over Redemption Gulch like a gentle rain after a long drought. With Devereaux's corrupting influence gone, the town began to heal. The shadow of fear that had lingered under Blackwood's reign was replaced by a cautious but tangible sense of hope. That hope was most visible at the Sweetwater Creek Ranch. The land thrived under Eliza's devoted care, the creek running clear and full. And she was no longer alone. Jake Riley had stayed. He had found not just absolution in Redemption Gulch, but a home. The weary, haunted man who had arrived seeking only to disappear had been replaced by a man at peace, his shoulders no longer stooped, his eyes clear and steady. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. One quiet afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the valley, Jake stood beneath a newly planted cottonwood tree near the main house. In his hand, he held two objects. One was the silver locket that had belonged to his wife Sarah, recovered from Kane's pocket after the collapse and returned to him by the authorities. It was tarnished and dented, a relic of a life that was no more. The other was the locket's twin, and the one Kane had torn from the young woman on the stagecoach. He had tracked her down and returned it, but he had kept the key that had been hidden inside. With quiet reverence, he dug a small hole at the base of the young tree. He placed Sarah's locket inside along with the key. It was not an act of forgetting, but of honoring. He was burying the pain, the guilt, the constant looking back. He was letting his past nourish his future just as the earth would nourish the tree. He filled the hole, his hands patting the soil firm. He was no longer running. Eliza came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. She said nothing, understanding the silent ceremony. They stood together, watching the last rays of sun paint the sky. Later that week, a final package arrived from the territorial office, the last of the contents from the safe deposit box, items deemed personal and not part of the official investigation. As Eliza sorted through the papers, mostly Thomas Kane's personal effects, her breath caught. Tucked between the pages of a worn book was a folded, crisp document. She unfolded it carefully. Her eyes widened. "Jake," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Look." She held it out to him. It was the original legally binding deed to the Sweetwater Creek Ranch in the one Miller, the clerk, had hidden and which they believed had burned in the land office fire. Devereaux, as part of his scheme to control the valley's resources, must have acquired it and hidden it away for his own future use. Her ownership, which she had fought so hard for, was now undisputed, secured forever by an ironclad piece of paper that had risen from the ashes of the past. It was a final, unexpected reward for her unwavering resilience. Jake looked from the deed to Eliza's face, illuminated by the warm light of the setting sun. He saw his future there, clear and bright. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Together, they stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, bathing their land in a soft golden glow.